We want to thank the Skipjack Heritage Museum and the Rock Creek Methodist Church for hosting this. We always look forward to opportunities to share our history. My name is Buddy Howard. My family, my father's side of my family, descends from the union between a European man and a native woman. And from that ancestry, we have devoted our time and treasure, so to speak, to relearning our native history of this area and sharing that with the public every opportunity we get. So I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope you learned something here today. I hope this becomes actually some groundwork for each of you learning more about the native history of the Eastern Shore. It's quite extensive. Native Americans were here for many, many more years than we as a country have been here. And that's evidenced by all the artifacts that are found along our fields and shorelines. So, with that said, Pocomoke Indian Nation has been formed as a nonprofit, a public charity, specifically for the purpose of preserving and sharing the Native American history of the Lower Eastern Shore. Our organization is currently led by our paramount chief, my father, Norris Howard Sr. He inherited this position from his elder brother, and so from generation to generation, we certainly before my generation, efforts have been made to further and to create what we're doing here today. Also want to thank Philip Goldsboro for being a part of this program today. Much of what you're going to see here today has been the result of research that has been done by Mr. Goldsboro as well as my father over the last 40 or 50 years. And that research was built upon research that was done by my late uncle, Harold Howard. So when we talk about Native American history here on the Eastern Shore, we have to realize that there were multiple populations of Native Americans. So the people who were here when John Smith and other early explorers came up the Chesapeake Bay were not the people who were here 10 to 15,000 years earlier. So we've got multiple migrations of people coming here, leaving, coming, leaving, and they're leaving behind the evidence of their presence by way of artifacts that we find today. Many of the stone points that are found are not necessarily points that would have been in use in the 1600s, but rather points that were made and in use thousands of years earlier. So the first, this is based on archaeological evidence. The first the first period is this Paleo period, and that begins approximately 13,000 BC. That's followed by three archaic periods, early, middle, and late, from 8,000 BC up to 1,000 BC. And again, these are based on the migrations of people into the Americas, onto the peninsula, where these people came and left and came back and left. We don't know necessarily the reasons why, except for the fact that these early periods were really hunter-gatherers more so than farmers, whereas the later woodland periods, they began farming probably because the climate became more acceptable for farming practices and seasons and whatnot. Because these periods, from the Paleo up to the woodland period, they actually encompass the end of an ice age and the beginning of that warming period. So we're going to fast forward and come up to the late woodland period, and this is where the Pocomoke paramountcy would have first been contacted by Europeans in and around the 1600s. Actually, a little bit earlier than that, in the late 1500s. But this is generally the time frame that the Pocomoke would have been here up through European contact. This map depicts what is known as the northeastern woodland region. So this area of the United States is considered a different culture, a different region of Native American presence than that further to the south or further to the west. A lot of times when we think of Native Americans, we think of the stereotypical powwow image. And much of the powwow presence or imagery is actually an influence from Western tribes who have been able to retain their culture better because their contact with Europeans came much later than the natives here on the Eastern Shore. So while much of our local culture has been lost because of time, it's been filled in by many of these Western tribes in the forms of powwows. So when you see people in very flamboyant headdresses and dancing regalia, that's not necessarily typical of this area. A good example of that is the powwow drum, which is a large drum that 4 or 5 people may sit around and play. In this area, the drum was referred to as a water drum, and it was much smaller, many times only played by one person at a time, and it was made from a hollow log with a tanned hide, deer hide, stretched across it. The reason it gets the name water drum is the bottom of that hollow log was sealed, and water was placed in the drum, into the log, to alter its tone. So hence the name water drum. We have examples of that. We don't have one here today, but we do have examples of that in other venues that we demonstrate. So within the northeastern woodland family of natives, there are 3 different language families: Iroquoian, Siouan, and Algonquin. And Algonquin, of those language families, is actually the largest, and it's the language family that was spoken by the Pocomoke. Now, within the Algonquin language family, there are multiple dialects, just like you might see in Europe with the Latin language family, where you would have Spanish and French. You know, these types of different dialects. We even see that to some degree in this area when you get into Smith Island and Tangier Island. It's discernible, but it's different. Okay, so as populations are isolated from one another, their dialects tend to get more focused and become somewhat different than the larger area around them. This map was created in conjunction with the Maryland State Arts Council. It depicts the Pocomoke sphere of influence here in gold on the map. Now, a sphere of influence isn't necessarily an entire occupation. What this is evidence of is the area in which the Pocomoke interacted, either occupied or directly interacted with other groups. So you see here in Worcester County, we know, for example, that the Assetigs also occupied portions of what's now Worcester County. The Pocomoke and the Assetig interacted with each other, as did the Pocomoke and the Nanticoke, and the Pocomoke and tribes to the south. Down here in this lower area, what we today call Chincoteague was actually a band of the Pocomokes called the Gingatig. Now, I'll say this early on. Many of the spellings of these words vary. Okay, so even the spelling of Pocomoke, if you look in the old records, the spellings vary. Certainly, words like Minokan or Gingatig, those spellings vary. And it depends on whoever was writing the record, creating the record at the time, whether it was a court in St. Mary's or a court in Somerset County or an explorer. They hear the word spoken by a native and they write that word out in their language as best as they can. So if the writer was German, for example, they're going to spell it remarkably different than if the writer is English, even though they're all spelling it phonetically. This is the more direct area that the Pocomoke occupied. Runs from the Menai Bay area down into Virginia, down below the Pocomoke Sound, and from the beach to the bay. These are the bands of the Pocomoke. So we said earlier that my father is currently the paramount chief. The reason for the word paramount is the Pocomoke were representative of a group of tribes. Much like the state of Maryland was representative of a group of counties, the Pocomoke were a paramountcy of tribes, or a confederacy, some would call it, in which all of these various different bands or sub-tribes would have their own specific area, but they would all work together, and we would find later in the early Maryland records that they are actually represented in treaties by the king of the Pocomoke. So here we have the Gingatig, again, modern Chincoteague area, the Quindoquin. Some of you are probably familiar with the area near Marion Station, still called Quindaqua. Marumsco, Anamessic, Aquinica, Nuswadux, and Minokan. These are the bands that we're currently aware of that were definitely part of the Pocomoke Nation. And these particular bands are referenced in a work that was done through the Smithsonian Institute. They call it the Handbook of North American Indians. It's many volumes. It's really like the Encyclopedia Britannica of information on North American Indians. And we're in volume 15 of that publication. So this map, and I want to give, again, specific credit to Mr. Goldsboro for the creation of this. This is based on research in multiple land records. And I think rather than for me to get into that too awful much, I'm going to ask Mr. Goldsboro just to speak on this briefly about how he came to the conclusion as to where these various villages were, from up near Salisbury all the way down through Gingatig.
First of all, Maryland is very lucky. We have a lot of data, original data, that wasn't destroyed, and also the patent records for Maryland, the whole area of Maryland today, started in 1637, which is very early. Those records actually are not right here. It's probably around the 1650s, late 1650s, before anybody's really patenting land here. The Calverts are calling it their eastern shore of Maryland, and that's why it's called the Eastern Shore. The records are wrote with a quill, with a feather. So very early on, these records are deteriorating a little bit. So in 1740, the state of Maryland decided to redo them, and many of them are called transcripts. They're very accurate to the original record. We have a little bit of the original record, but we have all of the transcripts. So we have a lot of data. That data is not retrievable with a computer. You can't take the computer and go on the internet and look through these records. You've really got to read those records. They're very difficult to read because of the writing and the style of writing, but there's tons of information in there, and we're constantly working on those. It takes years to go through these records and find things. But what we have found is the area of Rockawakan, which is an actual group of native people called the Rockawakan Indians in the record, and the river itself is known as the Rockawakan River, including the city of Salisbury was built in the fork of the Rockawakan River. Tundatank is an Indian town. It's up there, and that's in the records quite a bit. Believe it or not, it was once in Worcester County because of the way we broke the area up, okay? We don't know for sure who the Tundatank people were. That's probably the name of the place. We suspect they could be Nanticoke. We don't know that. We're still working on that information. Menai is an interesting place because in the early records, it's known as Many, M-A-N-M-Y, not Menai. So Menai is a corruption of an older word, just like the little village up the road here called Menai, and now we have Menai Creek, big and little. In the early records, they're Many Creek, big and little. So the Bandi are a group of people which are now showing up as Mani. Minokan is another interesting area because right up this river here, people are coming in. We've got a lot of records about people coming in from Virginia before Maryland even patented land over here as early as 1612. And they're coming up and mentioning this Indian town or village, and that is known as Mananokan in the early records. Spelled a little bit different than it is today. So in modern times, we kind of corrupted these hard to pronounce words to something that's better on a sign or on a document. And that seems to be what's going on there. In the area of Crisfield, we don't have a lot of information about that, except it was known as the Anamese, not Anamesic. Anamesic is an English corruption of an earlier word, Anamese. Okay? So, but this, another thing that seems to happen is where there's a river, on both sides of that river, including the Minokan, we have native people on both sides where the river gets its name. The Minokans lived on the Minokan River. They're on both sides. The Pocomoke's the same way, on both sides. So that seems to be a trend. When you see a name of a river, it's pretty sure the name of the people there as well. Okay? Now, as we go over to the Pocomoke River is a very interesting place because it settled very early. In the 1650s, people from Virginia are coming up in this area trading with the Indians. And when the Eastern Shore becomes developed by the Calverts, the land records are indicating people are getting 3,000 acres of land. And many of these are along the edge of the river. People are living there, and they're trading with them, and we suspect that the reason for patenting that land, which is just a rent, is you're protecting the people there and you're trading with them, keeping other colonial people from taking that piece of land. Another interesting thing is Dividing Creek, and on some of the maps you'll see it a little bit better explained. The word Dividing Creek is dividing Worcester County and Somerset today. Our politicians didn't come up with that name. That name was there very early. And what that is a division between the Dividing Creek right here and the Nassawango Creek today, okay? And that was known as Ascomanaconsin Creek early on in the early records. That piece of land in between that is called Nuswattucks, which is a sub-tribe of the Pocomoke people. So in the records, in the early patents, it says the Dividing Creek, dividing Aquidca from Nuswattucks. So Quimpanqua, Ascomanaconsin, Anokan are showing up in an early record. This is 1686, I believe, on the proclamation, where they are finally saying, leave these people alone around these villages, a 3-mile radius. We kind of call them today as a reservation, but they're not a reservation. They were set up a 3-mile radius around these little villages and towns to protect the native people that live there.
Multiple spellings exist in primary source documents, but the native pronunciation is speculative. To assist in research and understanding, the Mais Indigenous Records website, a project of the Maryland State Archives, is a valuable tool.
Okay, so this again, Mr. Goldsboro put this map together. In addition to the towns, we have this map depicting Indian bridges and Indian paths. Now, we don't, generally speaking, I know I didn't really appreciate the fact that natives were building bridges across these waterways, not across large rivers, but across these small creeks and guts, so that they could move back and forth as they needed to. Makes perfect sense when you think about it, but until we saw it in the record, we just didn't appreciate that. So the Indian bridges are depicted with the red star, and you can see they're quite they appear quite often. Again, this is based on research that has into these land records that has talked about these bridges, because these become landmarks for surveyors of the day to separate one person's land patent from another. So they use these landmarks, whether they be waterways or, in this case, bridges. We also see evidence in these records of Indian paths, and depicted here with these green lines. And you can see that some of them appear to go to not necessarily intersect with other places, And that's only because we're still working on that research and trying to put that puzzle back together. But one that we have been able to document is a path that goes from a town called Parahawken, which today we know is Parahawken, up to Tundatank near Salisbury. So there was a path there that connected those two towns, certainly at an indication that these people are constantly working back and forth and interacting with each other. Okay, so this slide illustrates some of what we would today call trade routes. Routes of trade between tribes in this lower Eastern Shore area and tribes to the northwest and northeast into areas where we find other natural resources that aren't found here. So, we're in this red zone here, and there is evidence of trade routes that went up to the Delaware Bay, that went up the peninsula to what we would call today the Susquehanna Flats, as well as out once they traversed or got around the bay, out west to the mountains of Maryland. What do we base this on? Well, in large part, we base it on artifacts. So we're finding today in this area artifacts made from soapstone, just as one example. Soapstone was used for a variety of things. It was very easily carved because it's so soft. It's basically compressed talc, or talc, what we know today as talcum powder. So it's been pressed into a rock, but it's very, very easily carved. You can carve soapstone with a stone knife very easily. And so what we find today are pipes made from soapstone, banner stones, which is a stone that would have been attached to the handle of an atlatl to give it more weight and thrust, net weights that would have been used to hold fish nets down to the bottom. So we're finding these artifacts, but in this area, we don't find the raw materials of soapstone. We do, however, find it here in the Susquehanna Flats, where we still today get soapstone from quarries up in this area. One of the other evidences of trade to the mountains of western Maryland are dehydrated oysters that are found in the mountains of western Maryland, in caves in the mountains, that have been shelled, dehydrated, and stored for whatever reason they weren't used in these caves. So we know that those oysters didn't come from, Deep Creek Lake, right? We know they came from either Delaware Bay or the Chesapeake Bay.
We, the Pocomokes, were hunters, fishermen, and farmers. We, the Pocomokes, built canoes from white cedar and cypress trees. We built homes from saplings, cattails, and tree bark. We, the Pocomokes, made tools and clothing from clay, stone, bone, shell, plants, and hides. We, the Pocomokes, lived in communities and raised families. We were musicians of percussion, wind, and voice. Pocomoke Nation Incorporated is a not-for-profit 501c3 public charity that preserves and protects the history, culture, and significant sites of the Pocomoke people. We direct and manage the historical and cultural assets associated with the Pocomoke Indian Nation. We conduct educational projects, demonstrations, and presentations at museums, festivals, and parks, illustrating the life ways of the Pocomoke people at the time of contact with European traders and colonists. If future generations are to remember us more with gratitude than sorrow, we must achieve more than just the miracles of technology. We must also leave them a glimpse of the world as it was created, not just as it looked when we got through with it. Lyndon B. Johnson.